Today, we're going to be talking about the exclusive right of sale listing agreement with the consent to transition to a transaction brokerage. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful, but essentially what we're going to be doing is going over this agreement that allows us as real estate agents to sell somebody's home. And with that, we in the state of Florida, as a real estate broker, have the fiduciary duty of acting as a single agent for a seller. And that essentially means that we as real estate agents, when working with the seller, we want to represent them and only them and their interests in the selling process. If, for whatever reason, that we as the listing agent also happen to bring a buyer to the transaction as well, we can no longer act as a single agent to the seller and the buyer at the same time. In that sense, we act as a transaction broker that works with both the buyer and the seller, not as a single agent, but as a transaction broker. And we owe them different duties throughout the selling process. And this document includes that. It includes what the responsibilities are as a single agent, and it includes the responsibilities of us as a transaction broker. Now, we use this agreement versus just simply the single agent agreement because if we just had the single agent agreement and we happen to bring the buyer, we would have to have a new listing agreement signed with the seller of the home. But this document covers us in both scenarios just in case. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we're going to be doing. Now let's go into the details of some of the things that you'll need to fill out this contract. We're going to be going over this contract using Transaction Desk. That's part of the software included in your MLS subscription. And so what we did is we pulled a sample property. And when we do that, it gives us some information pulled from tax records, including the address of the property, including legal description. So make sure you have some of that already pulled, and make sure you double check that too to make sure that everything is correct. But things like the seller and the broker, that's us, and the seller is automatically pulled from tax records. The amount of time, the listing agreement that we have to sell could be anywhere from 1 day to 365 days. We can no longer, or we can't do it longer than a year. And anywhere in between 1 day and 1 year, we can set up a listing agreement. Once that listing date expires and we don't have the property sold, then our listing is expired. So whatever date that you and the seller agree to have a listing period, that's what we're going to have in paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, we just want to make sure that if there are any items, any personal property, appliances that the seller would either like to take or like to leave with them that aren't standard. So for example, things like the washer and dryer, that's not explicitly included or excluded in the sale. So we'll want to make sure that we make a note as to what appliances are and are not staying with the property. We'll also want to make note as to whether or not the property is currently occupied by a tenant, and if so, when that lease expires. Because if the property is occupied by a tenant, then the new landlord would be purchasing property subject to that lease agreement. And if you're purchasing a property with a tenant in it and plan on using it as your own primary residence, you'll need to know that you're not going to be able to move in day one. But if you're purchasing that property with a tenant in it and plan on using it as an investment property, it's something that you'll probably like. Moving on to paragraph 3, the price and the terms. So one of the most important things that you can have in your listing agreement is the actual price. Now, if you go to our previous videos about CMAs and pricing analysis, you'll be able to figure out how to come up with an exact listing price and what a good range of possibilities are. But for this agreement, you're going to have to come up with one particular number for the price that you're going to agree to. And as far as the financing terms, what terms and conditions the seller is willing to accept as far as the buyer's financing. Sometimes that's based on the property, sometimes that's based on the particular seller's wants and needs, and sometimes we can recommend as listing agents for a buyer or for a seller to accept only a particular type of buyer's financing. In paragraph 3C, we'll also want to make note as far as any discounts or assistance that the seller is going to be paying to the buyer. Since we won't know exactly what that number will be, if at all, we want to either leave that one blank or leave that to be determined because it all depends on the particular offer that's being submitted to us, whether or not the seller is willing to accept the point of paying for any buyer's closing costs. Paragraph 4 and 5 had to do with what we as a brokerage are responsible for, and paragraph 6 explicitly lists out those options and those responsibilities as far as what the seller authorizes the broker and brokerage to do. My recommendation, unless the seller explicitly says that they don't want their property on the internet and they don't want their address printed on the internet, that you leave these options blank. Obviously, without your address online, you can still sell your property. But if you don't allow us as a real estate brokerage to sell your property online, that becomes a much different marketing strategy. We can certainly do that as real estate agents. We can sell the property, quote unquote, old school style, but that would change our marketing plan as well as our pricing for the seller. So my recommendation is always to leave these items blank and not have to worry about that. In paragraph 6E, we'll want to make sure that we are using a lockbox and only withhold verbal offers or all offers if the seller explicitly wants that. So essentially saying that verbal offers are not official, and so we want our offers to be in writing before they are considered. Now, it's a good idea to give your sellers a heads up that they will be receiving a potential offer and that we have a lot of interest in the property, but until an offer is written, we won't necessarily be able to consider that an official offer. And finally, paragraph 6G, having to do with virtual office websites. What I always recommend is the seller making sure that you check the boxes there on line 72 and 74. The seller does not authorize an automated estimate of the market value, and the seller does not authorize third parties to write comments or reviews of the property. Now, that being said, these two options allow for us to be able to control the conversation of our marketing and our pricing. If we're having our listing on third-party portals, and those portals have their own estimate of the property that is vastly different than ours, well, then we have a discrepancy, and that might lead buyers to the wrong conclusion about our home, whether that discrepancy is in our favor, whether the estimate is much higher or the estimate is much lower and not in our favor. And then obviously comments would be something to turn off, as it is much more difficult to manage and review comments than simply turn it off and deal with the buyer directly that way. The seller's obligations, as far as paragraph number 7, what the seller is responsible for, essentially we want to make sure that the seller has given us all of the correct information about the home. So whether there's something wrong with it, whether that the sellers themselves are in fact the correct owners, if they are foreign citizens. We want to know all that information because we as real estate brokerages represent the property and the seller, and for us to best do that, we need to know as much information as we can. You'll see in paragraph 7F, we make a note for the seller's property disclosure. That's to make sure that, one, the seller fills out the seller's property disclosure, but if there are any issues with the property that aren't already made known here in the listing agreement, that they will come up in the seller's property disclosure. Paragraph 8, compensation. So for us as real estate agents, this might be one of the more fun paragraphs to deal with. This will determine what we as real estate agents charge a potential seller for us to be able to market and sell their home. Now, obviously, this number, you can have whatever you want it to be. This number can be a dollar amount. This number can be a percentage. This number can be a combination of such. And it's whatever number you and the seller agree upon. But what you want to make sure is that in paragraph 8, you're including the total compensation for both you and a potential cooperating broker. That being said, so for example, if you have your compensation set at $1,000 and you have a cooperating broker that brings a buyer, you'll want to pay them a certain percentage of that or a certain dollar amount of that. So if you agree to $1,000 total compensation and $500 goes to you and $500 goes to the buyer's agent, you'll want to make sure that $1,000 total compensation is included in paragraph 8. Then in paragraph 9, when we're dealing with cooperating brokers, that'll tell us what split we're giving to them. Also included in paragraph 8, specifically paragraph 8D, is our protection period. So that means once our listing has expired, so if you remember back from paragraph 1, how long we as a real estate brokerage are allowed to list a particular property, once that listing has expired, we are no longer the listing agent of record. But let's say if during the period when we have a listing and a potential buyer comes through our listing, but that potential buyer does not write an offer and close on the home within the time period of us listing the property. But then let's say that particular buyer comes back after the listing agreement has expired. We, as the listing agent, are protected within this protection period if that potential buyer buys the home within whatever days we determine. So for us, again, you can go up from 1 to 365 days. I like to split the difference, go right in the middle, 180 days. And so that way we, as listing agents, are protected for up to 6 months after a listing has expired, should a buyer that we bring to the table decide to close on that property. We would then be entitled to receive the compensation as listing agents for that particular property. Paragraph 8E, retained deposits. This allows us as a brokerage to receive an amount of the security deposit should the sellers keep a security deposit in the event of a buyer's default. This again is a business decision, and you can determine how much of this deposit you want to receive, if at all. Again, we talked a little bit about paragraph 9 as far as what we want to be able to give to our cooperating brokers should a cooperating broker happen to bring a buyer that closes on the property. And so at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about a single agent notice versus a transaction broker notice. And here you'll find exactly what those 9 duties are for us as real estate agents when we're acting as a single agent. And then when we're acting as a transaction broker, there are 7 duties that we are responsible for to uphold. Now you can see the duties are similar as far as dealing honestly and fairly and accounting for all funds and using skill, care, and diligence in the transaction. But then after that, we have various differences in the type of disclosure and confidentiality that we have to deal with our parties compared to a single agent versus a transaction agent. And I encourage you to review these options fully so you know exactly how to act when you're representing the seller as a single agent or when you're representing the seller and buyer as a transaction broker. Conditional termination. This is if the seller has decided to cancel the listing agreement before the end of the listing period. We as the listing broker can determine how much we want to be able to receive as a cancellation fee, if at all. Again, this is a business decision. We have a recommended amount of $417.50 as some of our basic costs for marketing for the property. But again, that is a business decision. If you would like to charge more or less, that option is allowable to you. Paragraph 12, dispute resolution. If for some reason something goes wrong and that's not specifically covered by this listing agreement, you can determine what the process is for dispute resolution, whether you want to go to mediation, arbitration, or litigation. And you have the option to sign this as the listing agent, as the seller, and as the broker as well. And with that, we'll come up to paragraph 14. If you have any additional terms that you would like to add to this listing agreement, we at Home & Homes charge a listing fee of $500 to the buyer's agent, and that $500 fee will be used to give the buyer of the property a 1-year home warranty. Home & Homes does not keep any of the portion of that $500. And if the buyer and the buyer's agent choose to get rid of that fee and not provide a home warranty, that can be done as well. But that's something that we need to disclose to the sellers, that we will be using part of that cooperating broker's compensation to provide the buyer a home warranty. And with that, we need to get our signatures, we need to get the contact information, and we can get that signed and ready to go. And once you do that, you'll have the seller sign it, you'll have you as the listing agent and the broker sign it as well, and you can use the AuthentiSign program to get the digital signatures or use your printer and have the seller sign it with paper. And with that, that wraps things up. So thanks for watching.